I died for 3 minutes. That's the truth. No poetic metaphor, no exaggeration. For exactly 3 minutes, my heart stopped beating, and I crossed into a realm no human mind can truly comprehend. But what happened during those 3 minutes changed everything, not just for me, but possibly for the entire world. Because I didn't come back alone. I came back with a message. One name, one warning, a vision so vivid and terrifying, I still wake up some nights gasping for breath, clutching my chest, trying to make sense of why me, why this, and why now. That morning began like any other. Quiet, warm, ordinary. The kind of morning you take for granted because it doesn't carry the weight of anything unusual. The sun filtered gently through the curtains in my kitchen, casting a soft gold glow over the floor. Birds chirped outside, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. I remember sitting there with my mug, watching the light catch the steam rising from the surface, feeling thankful for the stillness. My grandson Aidan was in the living room, nose deep in one of his endless science books, and Ava, my daughter, was upstairs getting ready for her shift at the clinic. Nothing felt wrong. There was no warning, no sign. Then, like a lightning strike from nowhere, a pain exploded in my chest. It wasn't just pain, it was like the very essence of me was being yanked out from the inside. My hands trembled. The mug shattered on the ground, coffee splattering across the tile. I tried to call out but couldn't find my voice. It was as if something had reached into my body and was squeezing my heart in its grip, slowly, deliberately, each throb a countdown I couldn't stop. My legs gave out. I collapsed to the kitchen floor, vision blurring, the world spinning like a carousel. I saw Aidan's face, his eyes going wide, his book dropping to the floor with a thud. I think he called my name, but his voice was already fading. Everything slowed. Colours bled into each other. My breath became shallow, then stopped. I saw Ava's panicked face as she came rushing down the stairs, dropping to her knees beside me. But I couldn't respond. I was already slipping. Their cries became distant echoes like voices across water. And then, silence. Deep, thick, infinite silence. The kind that wraps around your soul like a blanket soaked in ice. But I was still there. I was conscious. That's the part that's hardest to explain. I didn't vanish. I didn't fall into nothingness. I rose. My body lay lifeless on the kitchen floor, but I floated above it, fully aware. I saw everything with a clarity I've never known. I saw Ava's trembling hands trying to revive me, tears streaming down her face, screaming for help. I saw Aidan fumbling with the phone, his fingers shaking too much to press the right buttons, but I felt no panic, no fear, only stillness. Then, like a tide pulling away from shore, I began to drift. The walls of my home dissolved into light, not blinding but warm and alive. This light had texture, like silk rippling in water. It embraced me, lifted me, carried me through a tunnel of colour and sound I can't describe with words. It was like music, but deeper, felt in the bones, not heard with ears. The further I went, the less I remembered about the world I had left. My pain, my age, even my name began to dissolve into the current of something far, far greater. I don't know how long I travelled. Time didn't seem to exist. There were no seconds, no minutes. Just presence. Just the overwhelming sense that I was being taken somewhere important, somewhere sacred. I saw shapes, lights, heard whispers, not of voices, but of thoughts, of emotions. I understood things without being told. Memories played in front of me, but they weren't mine alone. I saw others. People I didn't know, children laughing, soldiers weeping, a woman giving birth, a man taking his final breath, all of it woven together into a fabric of life so immense, I felt humbled just to witness it. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A gate, towering, radiant, not made of metal or stone, but of living energy. It shimmered and pulsed with every step I took closer. I didn't walk. I was drawn. The gate seemed to open not by force, but by recognition, as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting. And just beyond it, a figure stood in the light. I couldn't see his face at first, but the presence was unmistakable. It wasn't fear I felt. It wasn't even awe. It was love, so total, so vast, that I couldn't breathe. That was when I realized I was standing in the presence of Jesus, and he was waiting for me. He didn't need to say his name. I knew exactly who he was the moment our eyes met. Every doubt, every question, every limitation I had ever placed on faith, on divinity, on heaven, it all vanished in that instant. His presence was like gravity, pulling me in, yet lifting me up at the same time. The light around him wasn't just illumination, it was alive. It pulsed, breathed, wrapped around him like it had a will of its own, and still, it bowed in reverence to the one who stood at its center. He was robed in white, but not like any fabric I've seen. This shimmered like the surface of a lake under moonlight, flowing and endless. His face held no age, and every age all at once. There was youth in his features, and wisdom older than the earth itself. But it was the eyes that held me frozen. Eyes deeper than oceans, filled with a sorrow so profound, and yet overflowing with a love that shattered every defense I didn't even realize I still carried. He didn't speak with a mouth, yet I heard him perfectly, not with my ears, but in my soul. His voice bypassed language, reaching directly into the core of who I am, into places untouched by memory or logic. And in that voice there was no noise, no judgment, no condemnation, only a quiet, aching urgency. He looked at me as if he'd been watching my whole life, every moment of it, and I knew he had. My joys, my regrets, my quiet little victories, and the many failures I tried to forget. They were all laid bare, but not exposed. It was like being known completely and still being completely loved. Then he stepped closer, and in that motion, I felt a change. The atmosphere thickened. I was still surrounded by light, by peace, but underneath it now ran something else, tension, like a deep storm brewing far in the distance. He reached out, and I didn't see a scroll or stone or anything physical. What he gave me was weightless, but I felt it. It sank into my spirit like an imprint, a knowing, a mission. Not words, not commands, just purpose. A silent commission pressed into the essence of me, and along with it came a name, clear as lightning: Baron. At first, I didn't understand. I was confused. Baron Trump, the son of Donald Trump. Why him? He's just a child, isn't he? But Jesus showed me more. My surroundings began to melt and shift, and I was no longer in the glowing garden of his presence. I was in a space between time, where visions formed and fell away like smoke. I saw the earth, but not as it is now. I saw futures, plural, different versions, possibilities unraveling like threads in a tapestry, and in every path, in every version, there he was. Baron, not as a boy, as a man, a leader, a symbol, sometimes calm, sometimes fiery, but always powerful. And around him the world responded, either thriving or descending into silence. Jesus stood beside me watching, not forcing me to see, but allowing me to witness. Baron Trump stood at the crossroads of a divided future. In one path I saw him rise with clarity, with conviction, his voice uniting people across nations, especially the young. A surprising figure of peace, not through softness, but through undeniable strength channeled into good. He wasn't trying to be his father. He was something else entirely. And under his guidance, I saw countries forging bonds of cooperation, technology being used with wisdom and restraint, people rediscovering values that had long been buried under ambition and noise. It was like watching the world breathe again. But the other path, The other path chilled me to my bones. In it, Baron still rose. But the air around him was heavy, thick with control, screens everywhere, algorithms dictating every move, artificial intelligence dominating not just our tools, but our minds. Cities turned grey, skies clouded with surveillance drones, smiles became rare and eyes became hollow. Faith had become outdated, replaced by worship of efficiency and profit. And Baron. He was distant, cold, untouchable. A ruler not in title but in influence, shaping a culture that had forgotten the soul. I turned to Jesus, heart racing, and I felt his sadness deepen. Not because Baron was evil, not because one future was fixed, but because so much now depended on choices, Baron's, yes, but also ours. Ours to influence, to guide, to awaken. Jesus never said outright what would happen. He never guaranteed anything. What he gave me was a warning and a plea, a spark of responsibility. He showed me that Baron's role in what is to come will not be small, that his voice will grow louder, that circumstances will elevate him, especially now, with his father's return to the presidency reshaping the global conversation. But what kind of voice he becomes, that is still being decided. And Jesus looked at me with that eternal gaze and spoke without speaking. You must return. I felt the pull before he finished the thought. Carry this, share it, prepare them. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to fall away from that peace, that presence. But I knew I had to. The message wasn't just mine to keep. It was a seed meant to be planted in the hearts of those still able to choose. Then everything began to unravel. The light, the visions, even the presence of Jesus. It all spiraled into a single thread, narrowing, collapsing, until all I could hear was the echo of that name. Baron. Over and over, fading, but not forgotten. And then, I was back, in my body, in that cold, sterile hospital room, gasping for air, surrounded by stunned faces, and I opened my mouth, still hearing that name in my head, still burning with the weight of the vision. And the only word I could speak was, Baron. Baron. That single word left my lips like a whisper dragged from the edge of eternity. My throat burned. My lungs struggled to remember how to breathe. The hospital lights were sharp, clinical, alien after what I had just witnessed. Ava was hovering over me, her face pale, soaked in tears, a mixture of shock and fragile hope swimming in her eyes. Aidan stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. The machines around me were going haywire, beeping erratically, lights flickering, nurses rushing in like they had seen a ghost. Because in their minds, that's exactly what I was. I had been dead, flatlined, pronounced gone. Yet here I was, awake, alive, eyes wide open with something burning behind them. They all tried to speak at once. My name, questions, demands, asking what happened, how I felt, if I could move. But I could barely respond. My body was back, yes, but part of me was still lingering on the other side. It was like trying to fit eternity into a teacup. The weight of what I had seen, what I had been given, pressed against my chest, harder than the pain that killed me. I knew I had to speak, to share. But how do you explain the infinite? How do you convince the living that you've met the eternal? They didn't understand at first. How could they? I kept repeating the name, Baron, over and over, like it was the only thing anchoring me. Ava thought I was confused, traumatized. She tried to soothe me, saying I had a rough experience, that I needed rest, but I grabbed her hand and looked her straight in the eye. No, I said. This isn't delirium. I was gone. I saw him. I spoke to Jesus, and he gave me a message about the future, about Baron Trump. My voice cracked as I said it. Not from fear, but from the unbearable urgency pressing into every syllable. Aidan furrowed his brow, his rational mind trying to build a wall against what he was hearing. He muttered something about hallucinations, brain oxygen loss, near-death phenomenon. I let him speak, but I could see it. Even through the science, even through his need for logic, there was something in my eyes that unsettled him, something that made him pause. I began to tell them everything. Slowly at first, the light, the gate, Jesus, the name, the visions, the two paths, the roles we're all playing without even realizing it. I told them about Baron's future, how it holds more weight than anyone suspects, how his father's return to power is just the beginning of something much bigger, more spiritual than political. I told them Baron will rise, that his influence will stretch beyond borders, beyond governments, that he will either lead this world into a golden age of wisdom and unity, or into a suffocating grip of control and artificial power. And that choice hasn't been made yet. They didn't want to believe me. Ava looked down, blinking back tears, trying to convince herself that I was just confused. She's always been the strong one, the practical one, raised in faith but grounded in reality. This was too much, and I could see the panic in her as her certainty began to crack. She wanted to believe, but belief meant confronting a world that wasn't safe or explainable anymore. I didn't blame her. Who wants to wake up and realize that the ground beneath your feet has shifted? That night, strange things began to happen in my hospital room, subtle at first. The lights dimmed and flared with no explanation. The air changed, charged, heavy. A scent, faint but unmistakable, roses, filled the room, though no flowers were nearby. Ava noticed it first, then Aidan. The machines blinked erratically, not in malfunction, but like pulses, like signals. They looked at me then, differently. Not with fear, but with a creeping awareness that something was happening beyond them, beyond me. Something had followed me back. They brought me home days later. I was weak, but not broken. I felt like a vessel, frail on the outside, but filled with something that didn't belong to this world. I spent those early hours in silence, watching the world through new eyes. Every news story felt like a piece of the puzzle. Every headline a ripple in the timeline I had seen. When I looked at Baron's face in old interviews, old photos, I felt it again, that pull, that weight, that warning. And then came the dreams. The first night I slept in my own bed, I returned to that place, not as fully as before, but enough. The light was dimmer, the gate closed, but I stood before it nonetheless. And on the other side, Jesus watched. He didn't speak, but his eyes held everything I needed to know. It wasn't over. The message hadn't been delivered yet. I had only just begun. I woke up gasping, heart racing, words tumbling out of my mouth before I was even fully awake. The decision is near. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't chalk it up to a dream or a strange coincidence, because deep down I felt it. This world is standing at a threshold, and Baron Trump is more than a political footnote. He is a fulcrum, a key. The future is watching him, but more importantly, the future is watching us. What we believe, what we choose to ignore, what we dare to speak out loud. And I was chosen, me, a 72-year-old woman who thought her purpose had already been lived, to carry a message from Jesus himself. A message not just for one boy, but for a generation. A warning, a hope, and a choice. It began with a single word. Baron. That name lingered in the air like a stone dropped into a still lake, sending invisible ripples through the room, through their minds, through everything we thought we knew. Ava froze, her eyes locked onto mine, trying to decode the meaning behind the name, trying to reason it away. Aidan glanced at her, hoping she would explain what I couldn't, but neither of them could grasp what I already knew with certainty, that this wasn't just a name. It was a prophecy, a warning, a future taking shape before the world was ready for it. They exchanged nervous glances as I whispered it again, slower this time, almost reverently. Baron Trump. Ava crouched beside my bed, trying to comfort me, her voice shaking. "Mom, you're confused. Baron, what about him?" I looked into her eyes and said the words that would haunt both of us from that day forward. "He will change everything." She blinked rapidly, trying to hold herself together. Aidan stood in the corner, arms folded, trying to stay calm, but I could see his thoughts racing. "Mom," Ava continued gently, "you've been through a lot. Your brain's been through trauma. You saw something, sure, but Baron Trump. Why would God tell you about him?" I shook my head. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about the Trump family. It was about something far deeper, something spiritual, symbolic, and yet real, concrete, and already unfolding. They didn't believe me, at least not at first. Ava thought it was a side effect of oxygen deprivation or emotional shock. Aidan began quoting studies on hallucinations, how the brain reacts to death, how visions can be the result of chemical processes trying to make sense of its final moments. I let them talk. I let them reason. I knew their worldviews were trying to protect them, but I also saw the cracks beginning to form. That night, while I rested in my bed back home, something happened that shattered their doubt just a little. The lights flickered, every bulb in the house dimming at once, then flaring with a strange, almost pulsing rhythm. Not a normal flicker, something else, something alive. Aidan checked the breakers, nothing wrong. Then the clock in the living room, one that hadn't worked in years, began to tick, loudly, rhythmically. Ava stood near the window, watching as a strange mist rolled through the garden, despite the forecast being clear. The scent of roses, sweet, unmistakable, filled the hallway, even though there were no flowers in the house. They didn't say anything, not then. But they looked at each other, their silence heavy with the question they were both too afraid to ask. What if she's telling the truth? The following day, I sat with them and described everything again. Every detail, every image. I explained the two futures Jesus had shown me. The bright one, full of unity and wisdom, and the dark one, ruled by silence and artificial control. And in both paths, Baron stood at the center, not as a puppet, not as a villain, but as a mirror, a reflection of the world's choices. I told them that Baron's path is still unwritten, but his influence, his presence, will shape millions, and the world is not prepared. In the vision, I saw crowds, young people hanging on to his words, countries shifting course because of what he said, how he carried himself. He wasn't loud, but he was undeniable. In one version of the future, he led people out of confusion, blending knowledge and empathy in a way the world hadn't seen before. In the other, he was distant, unreachable, cloaked in power, operating through layers of technology and cold efficiency. And the scariest part wasn't that Baron had changed. It was that we allowed it. Jesus didn't tell me that Baron would destroy the world. He didn't say that he was destined for evil. What he showed me was possibility and the weight of influence, and he made it clear. The world will elevate Baron, not through chance, but through desperation, through fear, through the longing for someone to follow. And what happens next depends not just on him, but on all of us. How we guide our children, how we treat truth, how we choose to see what's coming. I told Ava and Aidan this, and for the first time, neither of them interrupted. Ava just stared at the floor, twisting her wedding ring. Aidan tapped his foot silently, his eyes darting, processing. They wanted to deny it, but the strange occurrences, the power in my voice, the way I spoke about things I shouldn't know, they couldn't explain it away anymore. That night the visions came again. I wasn't asleep, not fully. I was in that strange in-between where the veil between worlds thins. I saw Baron, not the boy, but the man. He stood before two doors. One was bathed in warm, golden light, full of nature and song and faith reborn. The other, metallic and grey, buzzing with static and precision. Behind him, shadows moved, figures whispering into his ears. Some voices sounded like compassion, others, temptation. I saw his eyes shift. He turned slightly toward the light, then paused, as if he was waiting for something, for someone to show him which way to go. Then I saw a crowd behind him. Millions of faces, watching, waiting. Not to control him, but to see what he would become, and to let it shape what they would follow. The world wasn't pushing him. It was holding its breath. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just a prophecy. It was a plea. Jesus didn't just ask me to warn the world. He asked me to pray for Baron, to lift his name not in fear, but in hope. Because if he chooses the light, if we all choose it, something truly beautiful could be born from this moment. When I awoke, my pillow was wet with tears I hadn't realized I'd cried. I sat up slowly, walked to the window and whispered his name, not in dread, but with a quiet ache of hope. Baron, let the light find you. And somewhere in the distance I thought I heard a whisper return, not with sound, but deep within me. A promise not yet made, but waiting to be chosen. The story began to spread. It started slowly, neighbors whispering about what had happened to me, how I had died and come back, how I woke up speaking a name no one expected to hear. Baron Trump. For some, it was strange and meaningless. For others, it triggered a kind of curiosity that couldn't be shaken. And then, as word reached outside our quiet community, things began to snowball. A local paper ran a short piece. The headline was simple: "Local woman wakes from death with prophecy about Trump's son." They didn't mock me. They didn't sensationalize it. They just told the story as it was. And somehow, that honesty made it even more powerful. Within days, my phone was ringing non-stop. Reporters, podcast hosts, believers, skeptics, scientists, religious leaders, they all wanted to talk, some to listen, some to tear it apart. But I didn't care about their motives. I knew the truth, and I knew I had to keep speaking it, no matter how uncomfortable or strange it sounded to others. When I was invited to appear on a small national program, I hesitated. I'd never wanted attention, never needed a stage, but something inside me, maybe the same force that had sent me back, urged me forward. This is part of it, I told myself. This is what he meant when he said, "Carry the message." When I spoke on that stage, I didn't try to convince anyone. I didn't argue or defend or dramatize. I just told my story. What I saw, what I felt, what Jesus told me. I told the truth the way it had been burned into my soul. I told them that I had seen two futures, one of light, one of shadow, and that both futures centered around the influence of a boy the world wasn't watching closely enough. I told them that Baron Trump wasn't a symbol of power, but of potential. That the real question wasn't what he would become, but what we would allow him to become. What values we'd elevate, what systems we'd build around him, what example we'd leave for him to follow. People listened. Not everyone agreed, not everyone understood, but they listened, and something began to shift, not just in their minds, but in their hearts. I started receiving letters, hundreds, then thousands, from parents, from teenagers, from elderly men and women who had never paid attention to politics, but suddenly felt something stirring. They told me their dreams, their own visions, their doubts, their hopes. Some spoke of their children. Others asked if there was still time to change the future. And I told each of them what I had seen in Jesus' eyes. Yes, there is still time, but not forever. The momentum grew. Prayer groups began to form. Not for politics, not for agendas, but for clarity, for light, for Baron himself. People didn't idolize him. They prayed for him, that he would be protected, that he would hear the right voices, that he would resist the cold pull of power without soul, that he would become who he's meant to be, not who the world tries to shape him into. People who had never spoken to each other, atheists, believers, liberals, conservatives, found themselves sitting in circles, not to debate, but to hope together. Because something about this story, about the way it all unfolded, made them feel like it wasn't about one family or one boy, it was about all of us. And then came the final vision. It wasn't like the others. It didn't come in sleep. It came in the middle of the day when I was sitting in my garden, sunlight warming my face. I closed my eyes for just a moment, and I was taken, not far, not outside the world, but deeper into it. I saw the earth as if from above, spinning quietly, pulsing with both pain and promise. I saw Baron again, standing in a field of mirrors. Each mirror showed a version of himself, some noble, some cruel, some lost, some radiant. And he stood still, staring at them all, unsure of which one was his. Then, one by one, the mirrors began to fade. Not shattered, just gently dissolved, until only two remained. One where he was a beacon, a bridge between a fractured world and a new era of healing. And one where he was distant, isolated, a leader in title but hollow at the core, carrying out the ambitions of those who whispered only power. I saw him raise his hand toward the bright mirror, and then he stopped, as if something had interrupted the choice. I turned and saw what it was. United States. We were watching, all of us, not just watching, but shaping. Every prayer, every belief, every act of kindness or cruelty, every word spoken about him in hate or in love. They didn't disappear into nothing. They reached him. They tilted the scale. The future wasn't a distant thing written in stone. It was growing like a vine, curling toward whatever light or darkness we gave it. Jesus' voice came then, soft and steady. The path is not his alone. It is the world's. The future listens. And with that, the vision faded, and I was back in my garden, tears running down my cheeks, the sun unchanged, but everything inside me different. That was the moment I understood the final truth of my mission. I wasn't sent back to change Baron Trump. I was sent to awaken the world around him, to remind people that influence flows both ways, that the power we think we don't have is the very power that shapes tomorrow, that the battle between light and darkness doesn't begin in governments or empires, but in the hearts of ordinary people who choose to love, to believe, to act. And so I keep speaking, not for recognition, not for applause, but because this story, this impossible, miraculous, terrifying story, isn't mine anymore. It belongs to everyone. Because the question isn't, what will Baron do? The question is, what will we do with what we now know? Will we rise with hope? Will we pray for the next generation? Will we build a world that chooses light, even when it's hard? The choice is still in front of us. The gate is still open, and the future is still listening.